Hey everybody, I'm here with my review of Iron Lung, the debut feature film from Markiplier. Written, directed, starring. How was it? I thought it was excellent. I really enjoyed it. Uh, you know, I decided to go in blind. I know it's based on a video game, and I could have chose to go in and watch a playthrough or even play it myself, but you know I decided, what, I'm going to go in blind because for me, you know I could get into the weeds on the lore and this and that and how accurate it is to that, but for me, I really just want to make sure when I'm reviewing something like this, how does it work as a movie, and then I'll double check the lore after the fact. um, so as a movie, this works extremely well. um, it is a bit of a slow burn, and slow burns are tricky. I'm not gonna lie, slow burns are dicey, because you can have the audience check out, because it is a slow walk towards a ever building climax. But I think that Mark did a very good job here. I think the pacing is very deliberate, which is good in a slow burn kind of story where you're just slowly revealing things and building and building and building and building to this massive climax. I think that things were laid out pretty well. Uh, I think Mark did excellent in the role of Simon. Which is also a very iffy proposition for even a skilled director to direct themselves as the lead of any kind of movie, you know, because you're not necessarily always your best critic. And, you know, directing yourself, especially if you're not, you know, up there on the skill level, you can let yourself get away with many excesses, whether it's, overacting or even underacting, kind of mumbling your dialogue or whatever. And I don't feel that Mark fell into those traps. I think that he did very, very well in the role of Simon. Um, I like that this was very contained. Um, I feel like in the hands of a corporate studio, had they bought the rights, it would have turned into basically a CGI schlock fest because they would have not been able to, restrain themselves. Oh, there's these big monstrosities around this thing, and we need to show them so that the audience is hooked. They wouldn't have let it just kind of exist as it is, as this single room horror, um, where it's all about tension and ratcheting up the tension until you get to this big climax at the end. And that's not to say that there aren't moments where, there's some, CG effects here and there, but, they're used sparingly, which is how it should be. There isn't an over reliance on it. As far as accuracy to the lore of the game, I did go and watch some lore videos afterwards to kind of double check and say, like, okay, how does this work as an adaptation? And from everything that I saw, it works extremely well. It expands things where it needs to, but also adheres, where it ought to. And, uh, I would say that anybody who's a big fan of the game would probably be very, very, very pleased with what they got in this as an adaptation. You know, but for me, as somebody who did not watch or play the game or watch any playthroughs or anything, who knew nothing of the lore, I felt that this was a great film that was accessible. You get the understanding of kind of the universe and what's going on. It is explained, the idea of this, the thing they call the quiet rapture, where all the stars blink out and all the planets go away, and then there's just people who survived were all people on space stations and starships, and now they're exploring these moons and things like that, and sending convicts down in these subs to explore this blood ocean on this moon. And this is their way of, basically getting their freedom, but, you know, it's always led as kind of a skeptical thing as to whether or not they're actually going to let him out anyway. And, um, I think that that was played very well, you know, and, and so, this is something where, I think that there is a reason that it's coming in at, number one and number two, kind of toggling back and forth with Send Help, is because it is a good movie. There is good word of mouth on it. And, I hope it has legs. I would love to see it continue on and pull in more and more and more, and I would definitely like to see Mark make more movies. I think he hit it out of the park with this one, you know, and that's not to say I want to see him like relegated to horror, although I think he's done a very good job here. But I would love to see him make more video game adaptations of video games that he actually cares about, because, he's shown he can do it, and he can do it well, and he can adhere to the lore, but also make it accessible for somebody who's never touched the game. Now I'm glazing it pretty hard here. That's not to say that there aren't moments to critique. There were a couple elements that I thought didn't work as strongly as the rest of the film. There were some flashbacks in there that were kind of, there to set up kind of why the Simon character is there. What, some things from his past that led him to be a convict. And they're intercut in there, but they don't really build to a big reveal. They don't really get to that moment where it's like, oh, okay, that's what these flashbacks were building to. They don't detract from anything, but they don't really, because they don't get to that point of big reveal. They don't really add anything. So, they don't take anything away, but they don't really add anything. When I went and watched the lore videos, there was a little more to those flashbacks than what is revealed in the film. So that was, one of my negatives. The only other negative that I really had was that towards the end, as we're getting to the climax, there's some shaky cam stuff that I'm a very big anti-shaky cam guy. I don't generally like shaky cam. I think that while it's meant to kind of give a sort of realism, kind of, oh, this is how chaotic the action is right now kind of feel, I think it just really kind of detracts from everything and just makes it hard to discern what exactly is going on. And so that's, really my only other real critique there is that bit of shaky cam towards the end. But I mean, that's you could even say they're kind of nitpicks. The only real solid criticism is that the flashbacks don't really go anywhere, especially knowing what they were pointing to. And I get that there were probably budgetary concerns to get to showing what basically is an all-out war between two space stations. I get that you probably couldn't really go there from a budgetary standpoint, but at that point I would say it would have been probably better to just kind of pull the flashbacks at that point, if you couldn't show that big reveal of like, oh, this is what these flashbacks are. But like I said, those are two, I would say, fairly minor critiques for a 2-hour movie, because the flashbacks don't really take up that much. I mean, if you cut them all out, you might say 5-6 minutes. The flashbacks aren't very long. There aren't that many. They're just, kind of sprinkled throughout the film. So if you got rid of them altogether, it's not like these flashbacks took up a half an hour of film. You know what I'm saying? So it's not like they like took up so much of the film that it bloated it. They're just there. Like I said, they don't take away from anything, but they don't add anything either because you couldn't get to that ultimate place. So I definitely recommend getting out to the theaters to see it, and certainly would recommend picking it up on 4K. If it gets a physical release, I would definitely recommend it. And and one thing that I have to add here is this is something that Markiplier did on his own. He financed it. He obviously wrote, directed, and starred in it. Um, produced it. The whole nine. But the big thing is that he also distributed it on his own, and that is significant. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there saying, well, it's doing well because he's got this massive following and all his followers are going to go see it. And that may well be true, but that's why I'm hoping that the word of mouth kind of trickles out to people to go give it a chance who maybe don't know who Markiplier is, don't know the video game and all that kind of stuff. Because, you know, for all the hand-wringing that goes on about the theatrical experience right now, and oh, we can't get people back into the movies, we can't get people back into the theaters, well, because when you go look at your multiplex, you know and you have these theaters that have, like, say 10, 12 screens, and it's a wonder if you have half those filled with different movies. Maybe each, you have like one or two smaller films, and then your bigger ones have 3, 4, screens. And this is a problem that's been going on for a long time. I remember Lloyd talking a lot about these multiplexes with like 20 screens, and like 10 of them are filled with one movie. And that was back in a day where the kind of bigger movies could hold that. They were just selling enough tickets, the biggest of the big movies, that they could sustain that. But in these days, it's not. The movies that are becoming the breakout successes are these movies like Iron Lung, Terrifier. You know, these movies that were independently funded, independently distributed, and are kind of these new, fresh ideas. And I think it would do well for the industry to take notice and to make sure that in each one of these big, massive multiplexes, there's a couple of screens that are left open for these small, independent films. And, I think it also gives hope to those of us who, haven't had that success yet. That, there is still a little bit of hope there. That, especially in this day and age where, all the money people are so key to try and get rid of us artists and replace us with algorithms and AI slop. It's refreshing to see somebody create something on their own dime, and get it into theaters, get it out there, and have it be a resounding success. So, it really is something that I wish I was seeing more independent artists and filmmakers talking about this, and really kind of championing this, because this is done by one guy essentially, as far as financing and producing and distributing. And, yeah, I mean, he had a whole team as far as making the movie go, as you do, because it's a big collaborative effort, affects people, voice actors, other actors, things like that, and those people all deserve to get their flowers for this. But, you know, at the end of the day, we do have to acknowledge that, this was one man's vision who brought this, bought the rights, brought it all together and, assembled that team and wrote it and directed it and filmed it and got it into theaters, and it was successful. So, I would like to see more people who, champion indie art talking about this. Yeah, is it a video game adaptation? Yeah. Is it a, kind of weird little horror film? Yeah. But that's all the more reason to be, singing its, praises about its win, you know? Even if it isn't necessarily your cup of tea, and maybe you don't like the movie because you're not into horror movies. But if you're a big proponent of independent cinema, then you should be, really cheering this on, because it shows that, even something that was not, yeah, I mean, wasn't crowdfunded, wasn't, you know, uh, you know, done in, any kind of way with any kind of corporation behind it, that it can be successful. So that maybe they start looking more and more and more to try and find films that are these, small, independent, totally independent films that normally, at best, maybe they would get on Tubi, and give them a small theatrical run, even just for a weekend, you know? So here's hoping that, if Iron Lung has, good legs to it and it makes even more money, that, maybe these theater chains will start to take notice, and maybe it'll bring audiences into this kind of world of this independent art, instead of just, scooping up the corporate pablum that we've been getting over the years, and certainly before they start trying to shove AI slop on us in theaters. So hopefully this sends the right message. But ultimately, at the end of the day, get out and see this. It's good. Get out and support independent cinema when you can, even if it isn't one of these big chains. I mean, I would say even more so if it's at one of these big chains. Send them the message that you want independent art and cinema in your theaters. So, again, I would say 5 out of 5 stars on this. Like I said, your mileage may vary depending on how well you can handle a slow burn, but excellent film. Look forward to seeing what, Mark does next, if he does another movie. And we'll see you on the next episode. If you've seen the movie, let me know in the comments. Bye, guys.